The Whisper That Shook the Human Condition Part 1. There is a quiet moment most people recognize, even if they never speak about it. It happens late at night, when the noise fades and the distractions lose their grip. The screen goes dark. The achievement has already been celebrated. The message has already been read. And yet, something remains unsettled. A vague restlessness, an unnameable dissatisfaction, a feeling that whatever was just obtained was not enough. We live in an age of unprecedented abundance. Endless information, endless entertainment, endless opportunity. Desire has never been so stimulated, so curated, so relentlessly provoked. Every swipe promises fulfillment. Every goal suggests that peace is just one more step away. And yet anxiety rises. Depression spreads. Attention fractures. The modern mind, surrounded by more than any generation before it, feels strangely hollow. This raises an uncomfortable question, one most people instinctively avoid. What if the problem is not that we desire too little, but that we desire at all? What if the very force driving ambition, progress, and civilization forward is also the root of our suffering? From childhood, we are taught a simple formula. Want something badly enough. Work hard. Achieve it. And happiness will follow. This belief is so deeply embedded that questioning it feels almost immoral. Desire is portrayed as fuel. Without it, we are told, life becomes meaningless, motionless, empty. But lived experience tells a different story. The promotion arrives, and relief lasts only briefly before a new pressure replaces it. The relationship begins with intensity, only to slowly give way to fear, comparison, and expectation. The object once craved becomes ordinary, even burdensome. Satisfaction fades not because something went wrong, but because it was never designed to stay. Desire, it seems, has an expiration date. This is not a failure of discipline or gratitude. It is structural. Desire is forward-looking by nature. It cannot exist in the present for long. The moment it is fulfilled, it dissolves or mutates into a new wanting, a better version, a higher standard, a different object. The mind rarely rests in completion. It moves immediately to absence. Most people respond to this by doubling down. They assume the solution is stronger desire, more refined goals, or better planning. If happiness vanished, they believe, it must not have been the right thing yet. So the chase continues. Faster, louder, more desperate. But centuries ago, there was a man who looked at this cycle and reached a conclusion so unsettling that it threatened the moral foundation of society itself. He argued that desire was not the path to fulfillment, but the engine of suffering. That progress did not liberate humanity from pain, but disguised it. That the constant hunger for more was not evidence of vitality, but of bondage. He did not say this gently, and he did not say it optimistically. He observed human behavior without romance. He watched ambition, love, competition, jealousy, and power, and saw not a story of advancement, but a pattern of endless dissatisfaction repeating itself under different names. Where others celebrated striving, he saw torment. Where society praised hope, he detected illusion. As a result, he was largely ignored. When he was not ignored, he was dismissed as pessimistic, bitter, or dangerous. His ideas contradicted everything modern culture would later come to worship: growth, optimism, motivation, desire itself. Yet, despite the rejection, his insight lingered, quietly, patiently, waiting for a world exhausted enough to hear it. Because once desire is recognized not as a gift, but as a mechanism, something changes. The restlessness begins to make sense. The anxiety feels less personal. The constant dissatisfaction no longer appears as a private failure, but as a shared human condition. And with that realization comes a disturbing possibility. What if suffering is not an accident of life, but its default state? What if happiness is not the natural outcome of desire fulfilled, but a brief interruption in an otherwise restless cycle? These ideas do not announce themselves loudly. They arrive as whispers, and once heard clearly, they cannot be unheard. To understand why this insight feels so threatening, one must first recognize how deeply desire governs human identity. People do not simply want things. They define themselves by what they pursue. Careers become identities. Relationships become validation. Status becomes self-worth. Desire is no longer a feeling, it becomes a compass. This is why questioning desire feels like questioning life itself. The man who challenged this foundation did not argue that people occasionally suffer because of desire. He argued something far more radical, that desire, by its very structure, guarantees dissatisfaction. Not sometimes, not accidentally, but inevitably. Desire always points toward what is absent. It highlights what is missing, not what is present. And because the mind can imagine infinitely more than reality can provide, desire has no natural endpoint. Every fulfillment merely exposes a new lack. This explains a quiet truth many experience, but rarely articulate. The anticipation of achievement often feels better than the achievement itself. The chase is intoxicating. The arrival is anticlimactic. What was once imagined as salvation becomes strangely ordinary once possessed. The problem is not that people expect too much. It is that desire trains the mind to live in a constant state of insufficiency. Modern society does not merely tolerate this mechanism, it amplifies it. Entire industries exist to provoke longing, to remind individuals of what they do not have, to associate absence with inadequacy. Desire is no longer spontaneous, it is engineered. Yet even without external manipulation, the pattern remains. A person alone with their thoughts often discovers that stillness is unbearable. The mind searches for something to want, something to fix, something to improve. Silence feels like emptiness. Contentment feels suspicious. The philosopher who identified this pattern did not do so out of cynicism, but observation. He watched how pleasure fades faster than pain, how satisfaction is brief, while longing is persistent, how boredom emerges not from a lack of stimulation, but from desire momentarily exhausted, unsure of its next object. From this perspective, human life oscillates between two states, wanting and dissatisfaction, or fulfillment and boredom. Neither offers lasting peace. This was the insight that made his philosophy unbearable to optimistic thinkers. If desire creates suffering, then the promise that more will save us is false. Progress loses its moral certainty. Ambition becomes ambiguous. Hope itself appears compromised. This does not mean joy is impossible, but it does mean joy is fragile, temporary, and often accidental, while suffering is reliable and systemic. The unsettling power of this idea lies in how closely it mirrors lived reality. It explains why success does not cure anxiety, why love does not erase fear, why abundance does not eliminate emptiness. It suggests that the problem is not external circumstances, but the internal engine driving perception. And once this engine is seen clearly, it becomes difficult to unsee. The man who articulated this did not offer comfort. He offered clarity. And clarity, when it arrives too early, is rarely welcomed. But in a world increasingly overwhelmed by burnout, comparison, and relentless wanting, his whisper grows louder. Not because it promises salvation, but because it finally names the source of the ache so many feel but cannot explain. Desire, he said, does not free us. It binds us. And that realization marks the beginning of a far deeper descent, one that leads into the psychology of wanting itself, and the uncomfortable truth about how the modern mind is shaped, steered, and sustained by endless dissatisfaction. The man who made desire his enemy did not arrive at his conclusions through despair or personal failure. He arrived there through observation. He watched people closely, how they loved, how they competed, how they suffered, and he noticed something others preferred not to see. The more intensely people wanted, the more restless they became. Fulfillment did not calm them. It sharpened their hunger. His name was Arthur Schopenhauer, and he lived in a century intoxicated with optimism. 19th century Europe was a place of progress narratives. Science was advancing. Industry was expanding. Philosophers spoke confidently about reason, freedom, and humanity's inevitable improvement. History, they believed, was moving upward. Suffering was a problem to be solved, not a condition to be examined. Schopenhauer disagreed. He believed most philosophers were describing the world as they wished it to be, not as it was. Instead of beginning with ideals, he began with the raw facts of human experience. Pain lasted longer than pleasure. Satisfaction faded quickly. Desire returned endlessly, wearing new disguises. At the center of his philosophy was a simple but devastating insight. Human beings are driven by a blind, insatiable force he called the will. This will is not rational. It does not aim at happiness. It only aims at continuation, more wanting, more striving, more becoming. Desire in this framework is not chosen. It happens to us. We do not decide what we want. We discover ourselves already wanting. And once a desire arises, it demands satisfaction, regardless of the cost. Schopenhauer compared this process to a treadmill. One runs, exerting effort, believing progress is being made, only to realize that the scenery never truly changes. The goal shifts, but the exhaustion remains. Life becomes a sequence of pursuits, each promising relief, none delivering it for long. Happiness, then, is not a stable condition. It is a brief pause between discomforts, a momentary silence between demands. As soon as one desire is fulfilled, another emerges to take its place. If no new desire appears immediately, boredom rushes in, a different form of suffering, but suffering nonetheless. This is why Schopenhauer believed human life oscillates between pain and boredom. Pain when desire is unmet, boredom when it is satisfied. The idea that happiness could be permanent struck him as a comforting myth, not a psychological reality. Such conclusions were deeply offensive to the culture around him. Western philosophy had long celebrated striving as noble. Ambition was seen as virtue. Progress was treated as moral evidence. To suggest that desire itself was the problem felt not only pessimistic, but dangerous. Schopenhauer was labeled a misanthrope, a cynic, a philosopher who took pleasure in despair. But he insisted that he was not inventing suffering, only naming it. And what made his ideas even more unsettling was how easily they mapped onto everyday life. Consider love. It begins with longing, intensity, obsession. The beloved appears as the answer to a personal emptiness. But once possession replaces pursuit, fear enters. Comparison begins. Expectations multiply. What once promised peace now generates anxiety. The same pattern appears in ambition. A student longs for success. A worker longs for promotion. A creator longs for recognition. Each milestone feels meaningful until it is reached. Then it becomes the new baseline. Satisfaction fades. The next goal emerges. Schopenhauer did not see these as failures of character. He saw them as evidence of a deeper structure, one that governs all wanting, regardless of object. And this is why his philosophy frightened optimists. If desire guarantees dissatisfaction, then progress does not save us. Achievement does not liberate us. Even freedom itself becomes ambiguous, because we are never free from wanting. This was not merely a critique of society. It was a challenge to the psychological foundation of hope. To understand why Schopenhauer was so thoroughly rejected, one must understand what his philosophy threatened. If desire is endless, then the promise that life improves simply by acquiring more becomes a lie. If happiness is fleeting by design, then optimism is not a virtue, but a coping strategy. This was unacceptable to a culture built on motivation. Western civilization increasingly defined meaning through self-actualization. Become more. Achieve more. Express more. Desire was framed as the engine of identity itself. Without it, life appeared empty, even nihilistic. But Schopenhauer argued the opposite. It was desire that hollowed life out, not its absence. He believed most people were not living intentionally, but reactively, pulled from one want to another without ever examining the process. They mistook motion for purpose. They mistook intensity for meaning. From this perspective, suffering was not an anomaly. It was the natural consequence of being driven by an insatiable force. The mind, constantly oriented toward what is missing, rarely experienced peace. Even moments of joy were shadowed by their impermanence. What made this insight especially uncomfortable was its universality. Schopenhauer did not limit his critique to wealth or status. Even moral achievement, he argued, could become a source of suffering if driven by desire for validation or superiority. Jealousy, envy, competition. These were not flaws in social design. They were inevitable outcomes of a desire-based psychology. When identity depends on comparison, someone else's success becomes a personal threat. When worth depends on achievement, rest feels undeserved. This helps explain why Schopenhauer's work remained unpopular for decades. His lectures were ignored. His books sold poorly. More optimistic philosophers captured public imagination. People preferred theories that promised redemption through effort rather than relief, through understanding. Yet time has a way of rehabilitating inconvenient ideas. As modern life accelerated, Schopenhauer's observations began to feel less theoretical and more diagnostic. Burnout became common. Anxiety persisted even among the successful. People achieved what they were told would make them happy, and still felt restless. The treadmill he described had not slowed. It had sped up. His philosophy now reads less like pessimism and more like an early warning, a description of what happens when desire is treated as sacred, unexamined, and limitless. When societies organize themselves entirely around stimulation, growth, and endless becoming. Schopenhauer did not claim to offer an easy solution. He did not promise happiness. What he offered instead was clarity, a lens through which suffering could be understood, rather than endlessly chased away. And that clarity came with a cost. To accept his view is to confront the possibility that much of what we pursue is not leading us forward, but keeping us trapped. That the problem is not insufficient desire, but too much faith in it. This realization is deeply destabilizing. It forces a reevaluation of success, love, ambition, and even progress itself. It asks whether the human condition can ever be satisfied by accumulation, or whether peace requires an entirely different relationship with wanting. Schopenhauer's ideas remain uncomfortable because they remove the illusion that suffering can be outgrown simply by achieving more. They suggest that without understanding desire, every victory carries the seed of the next dissatisfaction. And once this pattern is recognized, the question changes. The problem is no longer what we want. It becomes why we want it all. That question leads beyond philosophy and into psychology, into the mechanisms of the mind itself, where desire is not only experienced, but engineered, reinforced, and exploited. And that is where the descent continues. Schopenhauer observed desire as a philosophical truth, a principle that shapes life itself. Modern science, however, reveals that he was far closer to understanding the mechanics of the mind than his contemporaries could have imagined. Today, we can peer into the brain, and what we find confirms his insight. Desire is not merely a feeling. It is a system, a neurological process that drives behavior with relentless precision. At the heart of this system lies dopamine, a chemical messenger often described as the brain's reward signal. But dopamine does not respond to fulfillment. It responds to anticipation. It thrives on wanting, on the promise of reward. When the mind anticipates a pleasure, dopamine surges. We feel excitement, focus, and motivation. Yet once the desire is fulfilled, the surge fades. The brain returns to baseline. Satisfaction is temporary. The mind is restless again. It seeks the next target, the next stimulus, the next novelty. This cycle, wanting, obtaining, and returning to lack, is amplified by hedonic adaptation. Humans quickly adjust to pleasure. A luxury, a promotion, or a compliment feels extraordinary at first. Days later, it feels ordinary. The thrill fades, replaced by a subtle craving for more. Desire, then, is inherently self-renewing, an endless feedback loop built into the structure of the mind. For most of human history, this system served survival. Anticipation kept hunters alert, farmers vigilant, societies motivated. Wanting ensured action. Desire was adaptive. But in the modern world, its mechanism has been weaponized. Social media platforms, consumer capitalism, and algorithmic feeds exploit this cycle. Every click, like, and notification is calibrated to spike dopamine, to provoke anticipation, and to maintain a restless focus on what we do not yet have. The brain, once optimized for survival, now chases engineered illusions. Status, recognition, and social comparison have become equally potent triggers. The mind constantly measures itself against curated images of success, beauty, and happiness. Envy emerges not because of inherent weakness, but because desire, amplified by society, creates an ever-shifting baseline of inadequacy. The gap between self and ideal is endless, impossible to fill, and therefore perpetually uncomfortable. In this light, suffering is not a failure of will. It is the predictable output of a system built to crave, anticipate, and never settle. The modern individual experiences anxiety, burnout, and dissatisfaction not as flaws, but as the natural consequences of desire functioning at full strength in a society designed to magnify it. The implications are profound. If desire is structured to be insatiable, and if society amplifies it relentlessly, then suffering is not incidental, it is systemic. Every marketing campaign, every algorithm, every status update contributes to a culture of perpetual wanting. The mind is caught in a feedback loop where fulfillment is temporary, rest is fleeting, and peace is rare. Consider social media, a technology designed to hijack the reward system. Every notification, every like, every comment produces a small surge of dopamine. The user feels rewarded, but the effect is short-lived. Attention shifts to the next post, the next comparison, the next highlight reel. The anticipation is constant, the satisfaction ephemeral. Millions of minds are simultaneously engaged in this endless cycle of want, acquisition, and craving again. Consumer culture operates similarly. Advertisements are engineered to provoke desire before the product is even obtained. Scarcity, exclusivity, and novelty become tools to amplify longing. The brain, wired to pursue, cannot resist. Desire becomes a lever of control, steering behavior, consumption, and emotion, all while disguising the mechanism as choice. Even human relationships are not immune. Romantic longing, friendship, and social bonds are experienced through the lens of anticipation and comparison. We crave attention, validation, and approval. When received, they do not satisfy indefinitely. The mind adjusts, and the craving begins anew. Envy, resentment, and dissatisfaction emerge not from malevolence, but from the same predictable patterns of desire. Modern psychology calls this the hedonic treadmill. Happiness and pleasure are fleeting, suffering is persistent, and the mind adapts quickly to novelty. This cycle mirrors Schopenhauer's philosophical observations centuries before neuroscience could confirm them. Human life, it seems, is designed less for contentment than for constant pursuit. The unsettling realization follows naturally. If desire fuels suffering, then a society built entirely around desire, growth, consumption, achievement, and stimulation cannot produce collective peace. The systems that surround us exploit the brain's natural processes, ensuring that restlessness is the default state. Anxiety, envy, burnout, and chronic dissatisfaction are not personal failings. They are structural, predictable, and in many ways unavoidable. Yet this is not a call for despair. It is a call for understanding. By recognizing the mechanisms that drive wanting, individuals can begin to observe desire instead of being driven by it. Awareness does not eliminate craving, but it illuminates the architecture of suffering, allowing for deliberate choice rather than reflexive motion. One begins to see the treadmill for what it is, and, perhaps, consider stepping off. Schopenhauer's insight, once abstract and unsettling, now takes on a new resonance. The mind is not a neutral observer. It is an engine of anticipation and dissatisfaction. Civilization, with its technologies and cultural pressures, amplifies this engine. Understanding the mechanics of wanting is the first step toward discerning freedom, not through the endless acquisition of objects, recognition, or pleasure, but through the observation, moderation, and restructuring of one's own engagement with desire. When desire is recognized not as benign motivation, but as a system that hijacks perception, a profound choice emerges: to continue chasing endlessly, or to confront the underlying structure of suffering itself. And it is here, at the intersection of psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy, that the modern human is confronted with the terrifying clarity of Schopenhauer's insight. Wanting does not liberate, it binds. If desire is the engine of suffering, then the question inevitably arises: is there a way to live differently? Must we continue in the cycle of endless wanting, chasing fleeting moments of satisfaction? Or is there an alternative, an approach to life that reduces the grip of desire itself? Arthur Schopenhauer offered one. His solution was neither simple nor comforting, but it was radical. He argued that the path to reducing suffering did not lie in fulfilling desires, but in diminishing them, not by external constraint, not through deprivation for its own sake, but by transforming the mind's relationship with wanting. The fewer desires dominate the mind, the less room there is for disappointment and unrest. This approach is often misunderstood. It is not about renouncing life entirely. It is not about becoming indifferent to experience or emotion. It is not nihilism. It is a deliberate, conscious strategy to examine which desires are necessary, which are superficial, and which are constructed by society to maintain control. By disentangling the self from compulsive craving, one gains a form of freedom rarely acknowledged in cultures that worship acquisition and ambition. Historically, similar insights appear across continents and centuries. Buddhism emphasizes the reduction of attachment, not as punishment, but as a route to clarity and peace. Stoicism advises focusing on what is within one's control and accepting the rest. Even modern minimalism, stripped of spiritual language, reflects a recognition that fewer wants can produce more calm and mental space. Across these traditions, the principle is consistent. Unchecked desire is a source of suffering, and renunciation, or at least moderation, is a psychological strategy for liberation. Schopenhauer saw asceticism and detachment not merely as moral virtues, but as tools for enduring life's inevitable discomfort. Compassion, too, becomes central. When the self is less dominated by desire, attention expands outward. One experiences empathy not as obligation, but as a natural relief from the narrow cycle of self-centered craving. By softening the hold of personal desire, the individual is less constantly driven by dissatisfaction and more capable of perceiving life with clarity. This path is not easy, nor is it widely embraced. Desire is seductive. Civilization reinforces it. Status, consumption, and achievement are celebrated relentlessly. To step back is to act counterculturally, to rebel quietly against an entire social apparatus devoted to provoking longing. Yet this rebellion is subtle and profound. By questioning which wants are essential, the individual begins to reclaim autonomy over the mind itself. It is crucial to distinguish this from mere resignation. Reducing desire does not mean giving up on purpose, pleasure, or ambition entirely. It means discerning the difference between fulfillment and compulsion, between meaningful striving and reflexive craving. Life remains vibrant, but the mind is no longer a slave to every impulse. Peace is not imposed externally. It is cultivated internally. Modern research supports the transformative potential of this approach. Practices like meditation, deliberate simplicity, and mindfulness reveal that when the grip of desire loosens, stress diminishes, attention sharpens, and contentment becomes more sustainable. By observing the patterns of craving instead of being controlled by them, individuals access a psychological freedom that conventional success rarely provides. The insights Schopenhauer offered, once considered extreme, now resonate with the challenges of a hyperstimulated, consumer-driven world. Ultimately, this path does not promise permanent happiness. Desire cannot be fully eradicated, nor should it necessarily be. Instead, it encourages a conscious engagement with life's tensions, an awareness that suffering is not a flaw, but a structural feature of existence. By reducing the dominance of desire, one can experience a more grounded, reflective, and intentional way of being, one that transforms the quality of awareness itself. The closing realization is unsettling yet enlightening. Perhaps suffering is not a problem to be solved, nor a state to be avoided. Perhaps it is a constant companion, a mirror reflecting the structures of desire that govern the mind. To confront it consciously, to observe it with clarity, is not defeat but mastery. It allows the individual to navigate the world with agency, insight, and a subtle, quiet freedom that the endless chase can never provide. The radical alternative is not a promise of bliss. It is a choice, to continue running in circles or to step back, examine the mechanisms of wanting, and cultivate a relationship with life that is not dictated by compulsive desire. In that space, there is neither guarantee nor escape, only understanding. And perhaps, in that understanding, there's the most profound freedom any human mind can attain.